Chapter 8 Thoughts on the Ray of Creation. Who knows the secret? Who can unfold it? Whence indeed this manifold whole arose? The divine individuals were subsequent to its arising. Who then can tell whence this great creation sprang? Whether beyond it there is a will, or whether there is none, only he who is the consciousness of all that exists, only he knows, and even he may not know. So recited the author of the Rig Veda, or Hymn of Creation, some 1500 years before the coming of Christ, for the Vedas were passed down by word of mouth long before they were committed to paper, and having expressed doubts whether even he who is the consciousness of all that exists knows fully the story of creation, the Rig Veda tells us that before the manifestation of the phenomenal universe, there was neither non-entity nor entity, neither atmosphere nor sky beyond. Death was not, nor therefore immortality, nor day nor night, that one breathless by its essence. There was nothing different from it nor beyond it. From this germ burst forth mighty productive powers, nature below and energy above. The universe has always been and will always be a mystery to man. There is nothing with which it can be compared, for it is all and leaves no room for anything else. And most people wonder has died, but those who still ponder over the mystery of their own existence and of their relationship with the universe resemble children who, having come up against something surpassingly strange, seek to lessen the mystery of it all by telling themselves reassuring stories about it. We have many different stories from which to choose. There is the very clever story told by the scientists, but it is an exasperating tale which breaks off almost before it has begun. Heraclitus, the father of science, started and ended his account of everything in a single exclamation, quote, "There is nothing but atoms in space." And this same truncated tale, occasionally with slight additions to it, is still being told by some of our present-day scientists. There exists nothing, they murmur, except dancing particles or except positive and negative electricity. It is quite useless to speculate about the nature of such things. But in G's ray of creation, I had been given new material of outstanding interest to think about. It was the story of the creation of the universe as narrated by a seer in a higher state of consciousness, and the first thing that struck me about it was its similarity to the story told by the rishis responsible for the Indian Vedas, a story which has been simplified as much as possible for everyday use. As I grow older, I become less and less confident of the ability of my mind, or of any other human mind, to see things as they really are. In my youth, I saw myself scaling fearlessly up great pinnacles of thought, climbing higher and yet higher into an empyrean in search of truth, and finally reaching out to capture it. With age, this picture of mine has lost all its heroism and its grandeur. I no longer see an intrepid climber, but instead a very small child, seating in some sort of kindergarten school and scribbling down simple words on a slate. Things have to be made very easy for me and my companions, for, however hard we pretend, our minds are capable of understanding very little about all the things which are of real importance to us. We can never hope to see them as they actually are, and must be content with only approximations to the truth. So during all of Ouspensky's interesting talks about the ray of creation, and particularly whenever anything of a very startling nature was announced, I would hear myself murmuring in an undertone, not exactly that, but something very like it. Of course, all these things have to be made very easy for us, and that was the simplest way of putting it that the makers of the system could devise. There was, for example, that rather astonishing and startling statement of G's about everything, including knowledge, being material. At first my mind shied at it, as a horse shies at anything strange, but undoubtedly there were great advantages to be gained by accepting this idea, if on further examination it turned out to be possible to do so. The relationship between mind and matter, and the way in which these radically different entities manage to meet and to act on one another, as they certainly do, has been an age-long puzzle to the philosophers, and here was an excellent way out of the difficulty. That the mind affected the body nobody could possibly doubt, and the best way of solving the puzzle of how it managed to do this was to substitute a monistic for a dualistic philosophy. Great advantages were obtained from regarding the universe as being composed of a single stuff, whether that stuff were taken to be mind or matter. At first I had felt that I should have preferred an idealistic to a materialistic monism, but the materialism advanced by G's system was so utterly different from ordinary scientific materialism that I was quite willing now to adopt it. Obviously, there were only two possible methods of closing the gap between mind and matter. The first being that used by the materialistic scientists, the method of bringing mind down to the level of matter, and the second, that of rising matter up to the level of the mind. This was the method which the contrivers of G's system of thought had chosen and had carried out very successfully. One of the immediate benefits which had been conferred by this maneuver of theirs was that it restored to the universe what both the materialists and the Cartesian dualists had removed from it: life, purpose, and intelligence. The system regarded the universe and everything in it as being alive, and living entails a ceaseless interchange between the organism and its environment, a commerce in energies so marked that it is often difficult to decide where the organism ends and where its environment begins. The system also implied that everything in the universe is much more closely linked with everything else than is generally supposed, so that, as Ouspensky had said, a change here on the earth might have some unexpected effects on a far distant world. In a talking of the ray of creation, he had also described the space between the various worlds of the ray of creation as being charged with forces passing in different directions, and these energies were a kind of spilling over of energies from living things into their environment. What is the interest to me at this present moment, as I sit at my desk recalling the ideas I learnt from Ouspensky in that Warwick Gardens room over 20 years, is that whereas then they were highly unorthodox, some of them now enjoy scientific support. For example, it was from Ouspensky, and not from scientific books, that I first learnt that matter and energy were really one and the same thing, and that the universe was in the process of creating itself. I am aware that the latter idea has not as yet been generally accepted by the astronomers, but there are many who now favor it, and who look upon interstellar space as being the matrix from which the material required by the universe for further creation comes. According to Hoyle, the quantity of hydrogen existing in space greatly exceeds the amount to be found in all stellar galaxies of the universe, and it is out of this spare hydrogen in space that the new worlds are being built. In other words, so richly charged with energy is interstellar space that some astrophysicists look upon it as being the womb out of which everything new is born. Summing up this idea in his Gifford lectures, MacNeill Dixon states that it is in this great network of radiations in space, and not in the condensation of matter in the stars and nebulae, that the creative energies of nature lie. Tangible and visible things are but the poles, or terminations of these fields of unperceived energy. Matter, if it exists at all in any sense, is a sleeping partner in the firm of nature. This is from MacNeill Dixon, The Human Situation. The continuous creation theory, supported by such scientists as Bondi, Gould, and Hoyle, postulates that the interstellar matter of the universe is maintained at a constant level by the appearance of one new atom of hydrogen in the course of a year in a volume of space equal to that occupied by St. Paul's Cathedral. At first sight, the amount of new material would seem too little to supply requirements for universe building, but when the vastness of space is recalled, and when it is borne in mind that fresh material is being manufactured throughout the whole of it, the total amount created becomes staggering. Moreover, many astrophysicists believe that the creation of this new matter supplies the spreading force responsible for the expansion of the universe. As worlds hurry into the far limits of space, and are lost forever, new ones are being formed to take their place. G's insistence on the connectedness of everything, and his statement that humanity is susceptible to influences reaching it from the planets, led to questions being asked at Ouspensky's next meeting on the subject of astrology. "Is there anything in it?" someone inquired, and to this Ouspensky replied that there had once existed a true science of astrology, but that this ancient knowledge had now become distorted. He also reminded the questioner of the fact that the sole part of man's psyche influenced by the planets was his essence, and that in modern Western man, essence was very rarely developed properly. This was why G had spoken of masses of humanity rather than individual men and women being affected by planetary influences. Ouspensky said that a story would best show how G had answered a similar question about astrology when it was asked him in the Moscow group. Ouspensky said that G and some of the people in this group went for a walk in a park and that G was a little in front of them. Whilst they walked behind, deeply engaged in a conversation on the subject of astrology, G suddenly dropped his stick, and one of them, bending down, picked it up and handed it back to him. G continued to walk ahead for a minute or two, as he had done before, and then he turned and said that was astrology. Astrology is concerned only with essence, and it is essence which determines also a man's type. He explained that all of them had seen him drop his stick, yet only one of them had bent down to pick it up and give it back to him. He then asked each of them in turn to describe what he had felt and how he had reacted inwardly to the sight of the stick falling. The first of them said that as he was looking in another direction at the time, he had never even noticed that G had dropped his stick. The second said that he happened to have been watching G very carefully at that moment, and that he had come to the conclusion that the falling of the stick was not an accident, but that G had dropped it quite deliberately. For this reason, he had waited to see what would happen next. The third said that he had been so absorbed by his thoughts on the subject of astrology that it had never occurred to him to stop thinking about it in order to pick up the stick on the ground. The fourth's reaction had been so slow that before he had had time to make up his mind, somebody else had done what in all probability he would have done had he had sufficient time, and by describing in this way their various reactions, G's followers demonstrated to him also their types, a subject in which G was particularly interested. Ouspensky told us that there once existed an ancient science of types, but, as he personally knew very little about it, he did not propose to enlarge on this subject. A feature of G's account of creation, which appealed to me very strongly, was the idea about the function of life on this planet. He described organic life as a film which encircled the Earth and which possessed certain important properties. It absorbed some of the energies reaching it from space, transformed them, and then transmitted them onwards to the Earth. According to G, life on Earth was no accident, but something which was necessary to the well-being of the earth. I now ask myself whether there was anything which supported this theory. When one took into consideration the teeming world of microorganisms on the land and the equally abounding plankton life of the oceans, it was not unreasonable to liken organic life to a film covering the earth. But was there anything which confirmed the ingenious idea that film is a transformer of energies? I had given this idea much thought since I first heard it some 30 years ago, and the most obvious example of life on the earth acting as a transformer of energy is provided by the plants. A large amount of the ultraviolet light reaching us from the sun is absorbed by the stratosphere, in which it brings about certain changes in the way of ionization, and is also responsible for two phenomena, the aurora borealis and the zodiacal light. But it is the fate of the light which penetrates the stratosphere which interests us most, for it is this light which is responsible for the phenomenon of photosynthesis in plants, a chemical industry on which animal life is entirely dependent. In the leaves of the plant, light supplies the energy for the building up of the smaller molecules of water and carbon dioxide into the larger molecules of starch, sugar, and cellulose. In other words, plants receive light energy, transform it into chemical energy, and the products of this ceaseless industry find their way back eventually into the soil. It may well be that many other transformations of energy are being carried out by organic life, of which we as yet know nothing. Of one thing at any rate we can be certain, and that is that organic life has played and is still playing a very important role in the development of the earth. I am indebted to Verdansky's very interesting book, Les Biosphères, for the following facts about the role played by life in the earth's evolution. By the term biosphere, Verdansky means the film of life which is spread over the surface of the earth and which penetrates the more superficial layers of its crust. He regards this film as a very active agent, or, to his own words, as a continual, permanent, and powerful disturber of inertia on the face of our planet, a description of organic life which is very similar to that given by G. Verdansky writes that life has such a profound effect on the chemical processes going on in the Earth's crust that if all life were suddenly to perish, many of these chemical processes would come to a standstill. The minerals in the upper layers of the crust, the free alum, all siliceous acids, and the hydrates of iron and aluminum would no longer be formed in them, because the elements out of which these compounds are made would have combined to form other chemical compounds. A state of chemical equilibrium would therefore be imposed on the earth, a chemical calm which would be disturbed only by an occasional upward thrust of material from the deeper layers of the crust, by certain gaseous emanations, and by rare volcanic eruptions. So slow would all chemical changes in the Earth's crust become that they would only be noticeable after the passage of long periods of geological time. Free oxygen and carbonic acid would also be considerably reduced in the atmosphere, and, because of this poverty of oxygen, oxidation processes on the Earth's surface would, to all intents and purposes, cease. It must be borne in mind that much of the work of the biosphere is so unobtrusive that it passes unnoticed, but for the researches of the bacteriologists and the chemists, the various activities of the microorganisms in the soil would be quite unknown. The work done by other small forms of life is much more spectacular because it is performed on a truly colossal scale. So immense are the undertakings of the foraminifera and the radiolaria that they lead to changes in the landscape such as the formation of hills and downs. In view of all that has happened and is still happening to the Earth's crust since life first appeared on this planet, it is difficult to subscribe any longer to the current scientific view that life stumbled onto the Earth only by accident. I am convinced that G is right when he declares that everything is much more dependent on everything else than the scientists believe it to be. So also do I believe that the universe is run on a principle of reciprocal feeding or self-maintenance, and that life is as dependent on the earth as the earth is dependent on it. There was much in G's description of the universe which should have raised a fierce resistance in a person reared, as I had been reared, on a strict scientific diet, such as his ideas about the receptive intelligence of the earth and of the sun. But actually I did not react to these strange notions as I might have been expected to react to them, for I have never been wholehearted in my acceptance of the scientist's machine view of the universe. I have regarded it as entirely natural that in the great machine age men should look upon the universe as a great engine, just as in a more primitive age they had looked upon it as being the home of gods and demons. But the allegory of the running down engine favored by the 19th century scientists, and the allegory of the jazz dance of particles which has now taken its place, give a very one-sided view of the universe. Personally, I prefer Whitehead's picture of it as a vast, living, and intelligent organism. The question of the viruses and whether they were living organisms or only ferments were troubling the bacteriologists of the time when I was studying G's ray of creation, and I was convinced that there existed no real division between the so-called animate and the so-called inanimate. All that distinguished the one from the other was that the animate and more dynamic, more precariously poised, more sensitive, and more consequently quicker than the inanimate to respond to environmental changes. The very stones enjoyed a rudimentary kind of life, and were in commerce with their surroundings, a fact of which scientists became more fully aware when studying things in terms of fields of force. No, there was nothing in G's ray of creation which affronted reason, and a great deal of it which was in harmony with Whitehead's philosophy of organism. The entities with which the scientists are dealing are not the sole realities, nor even the more genuine realities, for there is much in the universe they are unable to see, let alone measure. For convenience of study, they have made certain abstractions for the whole, but, as Whitehead has pointed out, these abstractions are nothing else than omissions of the part of the truth. Yet many people are misled by the scientists' abstractions and believe them to be the very bricks and mortar out of which the universe has been built. Having accepted much of Whitehead's philosophy of organism, I was both interested and glad to find that G had the same outlook on the universe as Whitehead, and felt, as he did, that we should not be able to make any sense of it until we had returned to it the intelligence and life of which science had deprived it. The more I pondered over G's ray of creation, the richer in meaning it became for me. It was the symbol for a great many different ideas. It showed that everything in the universe was closely knit with everything else, and among the other relationships portrayed was the relationship between different densities of matter. In the ray could be found every kind of matter, from the finest of all material in the absolute down to the densest of all possible matters in the moon, and since matter possessed psychic as well as material properties, the ray represented a ladder of beings as well as a scale of matters, a ladder on which every possible level of consciousness and intelligence was marked. Everything could be found there, from the supreme intelligence, consciousness, and will of the Absolute, down to the darkness and brute mechanism of the moon. At one of the meetings devoted to the ray of creation, Ouspensky had made an extremely interesting addition to it. He said that every note of any octave, and in this particular case every note of the great cosmic octave, might act as the do of some new lateral octave issuing from it. As an example of this, he placed by the side of the soul, the sun, in the cosmic octave of a note do, by the side of fa, the sphere of the planets, he placed a new note si, and he then inserted three notes la, sol, fa between the fa of the cosmic octave and the mi of it, the earth. See figure 3. I'm going to read the footnote from figure 3. The ray of creation showing the lateral octave of life which starts in the sun. The three notes of this smaller life octave, la, sol, fa, represent organic life, and they fill the interval between mi and fa in the larger octave of the ray of creation. Back to the text. He said that these three notes inserted between the planets and the earth constituted organic life on the earth. He then pointed out that the mi of this new lateral octave blended with the mi of the earth, and that the ray of the new lateral octave blended with the ray of the moon. He said that a great deal could be learnt from this smaller lateral octave, and that perhaps the most important lesson of all to be derived from it was that the life octave began not on the earth but on the sun. Here again G, as on many other occasions, spoke of things coming down from above, whereas all modern thought tends to derive the higher from the lower instead of the lower from the higher. What could this idea of life beginning on the level of the sun mean? G had previously spoken of the sun as being divine in comparison with the earth, and I tried to reconcile these two statements in connection with the coming of life to the earth. I pictured the great artist, nature, at work, patiently building up the molecules of carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, potassium, phosphorus, calcium, together with small traces of other elements, into larger and larger molecules, which grew not only in size but also in complexity. Carbon was obviously the most useful of these crude elements out of which life was being made, because of its ability to hold in its grip 6 other atoms. In this way it would make possible the weaving of those long chemical chains of the carbohydrates on which life so much depended. But at this point in the making of life, there would be required some new access of energy, which would bring together into some vital pattern these rapidly developing molecules, and also give to the new pattern the capacity to divide and thus reproduce itself. How this final step was accomplished may never be known by science, but some of the of the authoritative books I consulted suggested that in all likelihood those liveliest of energy granules coming from the sun, the photons, may have made an all-important contribution to the manufacture of life at this stage. Excuse me. In other words, the sun accomplished this final piece of work and became the father of life on this planet as the earth had been its mother. But in reality it was the sun which had initiated the whole process of the creation of organic life on this planet. The blending of the me of G's lateral life octave with the me of the cosmic octave could be easily explained, for when living creatures die on this earth, their physical remains disappear into the soil. But what was the ray of the lateral octave which blended with the ray of the moon? A question on this very subject had been asked at the previous meeting, and Ouspensky had replied that this note was very clearly connected with the idea of organic life acting as food for the moon. Some energy was liberated at death from all living things, and, according to G, this energy went to the moon. This idea was, of course, related to the idea that the series of the worlds which made up the ray of creation was a growing branch, and that the moon, if properly nourished, would in course of time come to resemble the earth, and the earth to resemble the sun. Recalling, as I do now, these old memories of Ouspensky's meeting, I remember that when Ouspensky first drew the ray of creation on the blackboard, I looked at it with considerable interest, but felt that events on such a great scale as these were of so little importance to me personally that it did not much matter what particular system of cosmology I accepted. But gradually I came to realize that different cosmological systems had different philosophical implications, and that it would be a mistake, therefore, to regard them all with indifference. For example, there was the great question as to which came first, matter or mind. Plato divided men into two groups, those who were of the opinion that matter had given rise to mind, and those who thought the other way round and believed that it was mind which had given rise to matter. Ever since then, philosophers have ranged themselves under these two headings, some seeking to derive the higher from the lower, and the others explaining the lower in terms of the higher. Broadly speaking, the West has favored the former view, and the lower has given rise to the higher, and the East the latter view, that it is the higher that has given rise to the lower. Up until the time of the Renaissance, Western and Eastern ideas on this subject were very similar, for the Christian church taught that everything came from God above. To think otherwise than this was heretical, and consequently all scientific discoveries had to be brought into line with the church's ruling on the subject. But at the Renaissance, a great reaction occurred against the ecclesiastical domination of men's minds. And many beliefs sponsored by the church, such as the belief that everything came down from above, were now jettisoned. At this time of research and revaluation, natural philosophers, as scientists were then called, were beginning to discover the laws by which the universe was ruled, and this meant that the great age of science was not very distant. The intellectuals of this period were inclined, therefore, to revoke the previous ruling, and to put into its place the more favorable one, that the higher had been derived from the lower. In their enthusiasm for this materialistic pattern of thought, mind was expelled from the universe, and matter put there to rule in its stead. But here in G's ray of creation was to be found a reconciliation of Eastern and Western modes of thought. By restoring the older ruling that everything came originally from the supreme intelligence of the Absolute, the principle of mind was allowed back into a realm in which it was very badly needed, and at the same time a place was found in the grand scheme of things for the manifestation of the mechanical laws of science. I realized in course of time how much more there was in G's ray of creation than I had originally thought. Whilst engaged in the study of the ray of creation, I came across the following passage in Sri Aurobindo's work, Life Divine. Quote, "We speak of the evolution of life in matter, the evolution of the mind in matter, but evolution is a word which merely states the phenomenon without explaining it. For there seems to be no reason why life should evolve out of material elements of mind or mind out of living form, unless we accept the Vedanta solution that life is already involved in matter and mind is life, because in essence matter is a form of veiled life, life is a form of veiled consciousness, and then there seems little objection to a further step in the series in the admission that mental consciousness may itself be only a form and a veil of higher states which are beyond mind. Aurobindo then goes on to say that this is the explanation of man's unconquerable striving towards something higher, towards God, light, bliss, freedom, and even immortality. And without doubt, man's restless urge towards something on a higher level than himself requires an explanation. Freud dismissed it all as man's great delusion, the obsessional neurosis from which humanity suffers, but it cannot be disposed of in this offhand way. Man possesses a faculty, a special organ for dealing with spiritual values, and nature never evolves useless organs in her creatures. She would not have endowed animals with eyes unless they had already existed, unless there had already existed light to which these eyes would become sensitive. Nor would she have put into man a hunger for something higher than himself, if there existed nothing by which this hunger could ever be assuaged. Despite the warning of the intellectualists that it is useless to ask unanswerable questions, men continue their search for spiritual truths, and as a result of their persistence, new religions arise to replace the older ones destroyed by skepticism. According to G, man fulfills the needs of the cosmos as he is, so that there is no need for him to evolve any further. But the fact that so many men are obsessed by this vehement impulse of inquiry and this unquenchable intuition of the existence of something higher than themselves is surely a sign that provision has been made in the great plan for the possibility of man's spiritual evolution. Here there's footnote 1, and the footnote is, the idea of two contrary movements, a downward creative thrust from the absolute, and an upward climb towards the source of everything, is to be found in the philosophy of Plotinus. And back to the text. It is also implied in Sri Aurobindo's writings, for he finishes his chapter on human aspirations with these words, and if there is any higher limit of illumined intuition or self-revealing truth which is now in man, either obstructed and inoperable, or works with intermittent glancings as if from behind a veil, then we need not fear to aspire, for it is likely that such is the next higher state of consciousness, of which mind is only a form and veil, and through the splendor of that light may be the path of our progressive self-enlargement into whatever highest state is humanity's ultimate resting place.